There are several groups and people that I'd like to thank before we get started this evening. First, the Lost Colony and the Roanoke Island Historical Association, particularly Carl Canute, who conceived the idea of the Land of Beginnings Festival, of which this storytelling event is part, and also our host here at Roanoke Island Festival Park for providing the space for the event this evening, and as well as our Dare County Public Information Office, Dorothy Toolin, Chris Balcom, who have recorded these sessions and who are certainly interested in helping to promote what we're trying to do here by preserving some of the heritage and the history of this land of beginnings. So I would like to thank them, also the Land of Beginnings Committee and Laura Cato, who has helped me with this storytelling session. You'll notice some changes in your program. When I first thought about this evening and how we might be able to share some stories of times past and of our community, I contacted Carol Lee Tillett, and Carol Lee has really been a fixture in the post office for a long time, and I know that everybody loves Carol Lee, and Carol Lee graciously consented to come and talk with us tonight, and one of my hopes was that we would be able to bring in some other people who had worked for the Postal Service, because it's kind of my concept that, like a school teacher, a postmaster is really considered to be one of the pillars of the community, and the post office is often a gathering place and a meeting place, and certainly the person who is there at the post office is one who everyone knows and is familiar with. And so there are a lot of contacts. And that's really what this is all about. It's all about contact. And the contact that we have as people who like to talk about the things that we love the most. And those of us who live on the Outer Banks know that this is the land that we love. So I wanted to, I'll start on here on my immediate left, Eddie Green, our living legend. Eddie said, well, I don't know a whole lot about the Postal Service. I'm a little limited in what I can say about that. Buster found out that a couple of other attendees or participants were not able to make it. So when I talked to Buster yesterday, he admitted that he'd been in the post office before, and I said, that's good. You qualify. Yes, I have. So, and Carol Lee.
I started in his post office.
Right. So, but Carol Lee, I'd kind of like to pick up on that theme from the beginning, from the standpoint of you're working over at Mans Harbor now.
I am.
And, I want to kind of pick up on that theme of the post office being the center of the community, and I'd like for you just to talk briefly about what it's meant to you to have those contacts with people over the years.
I'll tell you, you really connect to everybody that's there, and you really miss the people that aren't there year after year. I started in Buster's post office. I knew his mom and dad. I knew him. I think I've known everybody that's come through the door at Nag's Head. Then I transferred to Manio, and downtown we used to have Mr. Irvin Hines and Poss Midget and all the men that would come down and stand around the writing table, and they would solve every world problem, usually before coffee. Then I worked in Stumpy Point for a few years, and that was the general meeting place there. And people have changed and gone on and moved and left us, and I'll tell you, it leaves a hole. It's like everything else around here. Everything evolves so quickly. Before you even know what you've got, it's gone. Mm-hmm. And now I'm in Mans Harbor, which is like one of the last little communities left that still has that tight-knit, everybody meets at the post office.
Well, I hope that maybe on another occasion we'll be able to bring in more people who work for the Postal Service. Edward Hooper is another one who was on the program tonight who wasn't able to come. He called me a couple of hours ago and told me he was afraid he was going to get caught in the ocean overwash if he came up from Salvo. Oh. But those of you who don't know Edward was one of the last, well, he was the last postmaster at the little Salvo post office before they closed it down. And Edward has a high-pitched voice. He told me a story one time about one of his customers that he met sometime after he retired. And he explained to me that there was just a little window there where the mail was passed out. And after several years, he met one of his customers who was surprised to see he was a man, because she had thought for years, because she had only seen his hands and heard his voice, that he was a woman. And so, you know, being able to look somebody over the counter, but that little Salvo post office is certainly one of the historic landmarks on the Outer Banks.
I'm curious, is it gone?
It burnt down,
Oh.
and they had to build the new one, and that's when they combined them.
Right.
Of course, this is about as quiet as I've been in a long time, but I'd like to jump in on this conversation and share just a little bit about the Nags Head Post Office that used to be. There was a gentleman named Roy Kessinger who had a general store. It had a little bit of everything, and his wife's name was Fanny Kessinger, and she actually was a school teacher in the public school system here. But Roy Kessinger had this unique thing, and it's something that you alluded to in the very beginning of this, was being able to make friends with just about anybody who came to the post office and to share things with them. Here's some of the things he used to do. He had fudge days. He had bean days when you could come in and get a bowl of beans if you were hungry or something like that. But he gave it that personality, and I really believe, and I think Carol Lee will agree with me, Roy Kessinger probably started this thing we have here in Dare County about being so friendly at the post office. You know, you go there and there's just all kinds of activities going on. There was never a day that you didn't have a story that got told, or like you said, something that got solved during that period of time.
It's true, and Miss Kessinger was as sweet as she could be.
She was, and it was a part of my growing up on the Outer Banks. There were so many places like that. Harris Grocery Store. You know, you could go in Harris Grocery Store, which was right down the street.
Down the street.
Mattie Midget's store. There were just so many things that you could do growing up on the Outer Banks, and one of my favorite trips was going to the post office. I love the fudge. It was just right.
That gives me a good idea, actually.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
I did cake last year, but fudge would have been easier.
Well, he had chocolate cake. He was a cake maker. Roy Kessinger was a man beyond belief. There's not too many people that I could say could equal his cooking skills and his ability to please his customers and the people that came to the post office. And the post office was very small too, very similar to the place that you have over in Mans Harbor. Very small.
That is definitely very small.
Right. Well, you know, there are a few things that we know about some of our communities, and that is that they were named because the post offices were put in place. So some of the names of these communities were really changed when the Postal Service came to those communities and established the post office.
Yeah.
You know, even back before the days of the bridges, when we relied so heavily on boats for transportation, then there was the mailboat. And I used to think that the mailboat was just simply a boat that carried mail, which in many cases it was. But Mike Alford wrote a book on traditional workboats of North Carolina, and he has an illustration and a brief description of the mailboat. And shows one like a shad boat, but has a house that completely covers it. And one of his notations is that the mailboats were not only used to carry the mail, but they often carried other things like alcohol and other contraband.
Oh.
So
That tradition still goes on today. You know that, right?
no, I don't know that.
At Ocracoke, you see folks, or on the Hatteras side of Ocracoke, you see folks running up to the terminal and they're saying, "Can we get this on the ferry? We want it to go across." So there are items that are still being taken from one side to the other of our open waterways on these boats, and today it's ferries. And you know, that just shows the other side of the Outer Banker. It's always the generosity to help someone, and that's something I think is still carried on from the mailboat days.
Right. Well, you know, I remember Carol Lee and I were talking earlier, trying to put together when it was that we got to know each other. And one of the first people that I worked with when I came here in the early 70s was Captain Hiram Gallup. And for those of you who didn't know Captain Hiram, he claimed to have spent half of his life out of sight of land. He was a retired merchant marine captain, licensed for all vessels. And when I ran into him, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, because I wanted to learn everything I could about boats in the water. And so I thought that I'd found just the person. And after I worked with him for a while, I found that he hired me as a captive audience.
Yeah.
Because I would do odd jobs for him, and he would stand there and he would tell stories. But he told me that his father had delivered mail to Stumpy Point and to Manio and down the banks when, and I guess he was in Harbinger at that time. They were in Harbinger, but he sailed. But I know also that his father often crossed over Haulover Point into East Lake on some of those trips, and there was some things under those watermelons and straw, some things under that straw in those watermelons from the stories that he told me. Right. So you know, I've heard that, but that's about all I know about the mail boats and those days. So hopefully, you know, we'll be able to get some more discussion on that at some other time. But you grew up right in the neighborhood with Captain Hiram and Miss Gladys, and that's how you and I really met, was when I was down around the marina trying to learn more about boats in the water.
I grew up right across from Wanchie's Marina. My grandparents' house was right across the street, and I stayed with them for a while, and my parents we just lived down the road not far, so I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house right across from the docks.
Right.
That was the best place to be, right across from the docks, to go crabbing and sit on the dock and fish for minnows and eels, lots of eels.
Right. Well, that was, you know, that's when that was a creek, when that basin, that seafood industrial park was just a creek.
Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago either. You know,
No.
in the 70s, I remember on nights like this, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight too, because, you know, a cold blowing night is not the best time to venture out. But I can remember, I was living in Morrison Grove. I just arrived here on the banks, and of course there was electric baseboard heat there. And when it would blow like this for 2 or 3 days, the power would go out.
Yeah.
So I would go down to Wanchie's and sit around the fireplace with Captain Hiram and Miss Gladys and listen to stories all afternoon. And one of their relatives, Les Hooper, who was Edward Hooper's brother, Captain Les was a mentor and another dear friend. And I remember asking Captain Les one day, I said, down in Salvo, did y'all ever have problems with your power going off? And he looked at me and he said, you know, we used to have trouble with the power coming on. So again, I'm sorry that Edward is not here with us tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get him to share some stories with us sometime.
That was always the first wedding present in Wanchie's, was a kerosene lamp.
Oh,
To
boy.
anybody that was getting married, that was your first present, a kerosene lamp.
Well, Buster, talk to us a little bit about, and I know you lived in Manio until you were 5, then moved over to Nags Head where you spent the majority of your life.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about, well, talk to me about your parents and grandparents a little bit. Tell us about your family. And,
My family, actually, my grandfather was a turpentine farmer, and he sailed from New Jersey to the West Indies and had pine plantation in the West Indies. And when things started to change a little bit, he had to change his mode of direction and things. But he sailed from New Jersey to there and then back with his crop or however they did turpentine back in those days. But then he had to move to the Sandhills of North Carolina, over around Wagram, North Carolina, Laurinburg area, and he bought some farmland over there, and they did the pine plantation there. But he also grew watermelons, and it's really a strange situation. I found a receipt not too long ago for a train load of watermelons back in I'd say probably the 1920s. $33.14 for a trainload of watermelon. Now that was a lot of hard work for my dad and his brother Charles and my grandfather, and I'm pretty sure my grandmother was a part of that too. But as time progressed, in 1948, my parents moved to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and lo and behold, in 1949, I was born a true Outer Banker. I was born here on the Outer Banks. We lived in Manteo for 5 years in a house that's still standing today. If you know where the county office, old office building or the meeting room is, you know there's a gravel parking lot there. And Ms. Bell had a little small house that was probably about the size or a little bit less than what the size of this room is, and it's still standing today across from the Methodist Church. My parents, my dad worked for Haslund Creek Chevrolet for many years. My mother worked for the Lost Colony as an usher, and she also worked at Ras Wescott's Quizzo or Bingo over on the beach. It was really great growing up in that time. You hear Andy Griffin talk about Doc Harvey. Well, I knew Doc Harvey really well because I spent most of the time laying flat on my back in his office having something done to me by Doc Harvey, and so I know Wallace Harvey very well because of that. And we moved to Nags Head several years after that, and my mom and dad and my uncle and my grandfather went into the seafood business, and they were in that business for 41 years here on the Outer Banks, both wholesale and retail. And my dad got into politics, and of course my mom took care of the business at that time, and it was the seafood business, and virtually went into a hardware store and some other ventures. But my dad was in politics, and I was in politics, and he was a big part of Nags Head's development. He was on the first planning board. He and 6 other men borrowed money to build the Jockey's Ridge Fire Station, which is there. They borrowed money to buy the fire trucks and a lot of the things that started. He was on the first water and sewer authority on the Outer Banks, and so my history is basically in Nags Head, but I am a true Outer Banker.
He was the first mayor too, wasn't he?
Actually, he was I think the 3rd mayor of Nags Head, and he was there for 10 years as mayor, and I believe 6 years prior to that as a city councilman. And everybody would say about my dad, he was a farm boy, which, growing up on a farm, he had good common sense, but he didn't have a whole lot of things that people really needed, but he really did a good job, and it shows every day in the things that we see now. A lot of the things, if you remember the water tower that just was taken down, my dad was on the city council and I think mayor at the time that water tower was built. The geometric domes that everybody used to talk about, the first town hall in the town of Nags Head was built during that period of time. But a lot of things transpired over that time, Horace, and a lot of history. I wish we could go back to those days. We all seem to be fighting turf battles, in the county and in eastern North Carolina with different things. And I think that one thing that I feel is we've got to learn how to communicate better. It's a big portion of what the problem is. We're not communicating with one another. So.
Well, I think that's really the point of these sessions, is that we don't communicate the way that we used to, and so much of the contact that we've had as human beings has really been lost through our use of technology or our dependence on technology.
I think we've lost contact with who we really are. There are are some of us that know who we are. I mean, I can look at Mr. Green and I can call him Eddie. I can call you Horace, and I can call her Carol Lee, and anyone else that I know like that. But you go in places this day and time on the Outer Banks and the post office, for instance, you might not know who that person is.
Sure.
We've lost that personality, that personal contact, and I think we need to regain that as a community.
Well, I'm going to ask Carol Lee to talk a little bit about her family and her background, and then we'll come back to that, Buster, before we conclude.
Well,
You told me that your grandparents had a place in Duck, had a bed and breakfast boarding house.
a boarding house, and my granddaddy owned the general store. My mom and her sisters and her brother, they worked in that store from that time they were old enough to see over the counter, I think. My grandfather was a shooter. He took people out. People would come down, and they didn't actually hunt themselves. He took them out, and he shot the game for them, brought it back and cleaned it and dressed it, and then they took it home.
And that's real sport.
That's how they did it back then. That was how they did it. And like I said, then when the war came, my grandparents had to close the store because people had charge accounts then, and things got really lean, and they moved to Norfolk, and my grandfather went to work at the shipyard where he worked until he retired, and then when he came back to Wanchese, and right across from Miss Gladys and Mr. Harmon. He built boats there until he died. And so I kind of grew up down the road right there, and it was great growing up there. It was a wonderful place to be a kid. No paved roads, ponies to ride. My aunt had ponies and horses, and so we all had horses to ride all day long, and camps and forts to build, and things that my kids have never seen, will never be able to do.
Well, you also said you spent some time up in Duck.
We did. On Sundays, it was family day. We went to Duck every single Sunday, as long as my grandparents were alive. And because my grandmother's sister lived up there, you might know Pop's Duck Shop that was right in the heart of Duck. That was my grandmother's brother, Levin Scarborough. And I was actually just in Duck last weekend, and I was in culture shock. Uncle Lev's house was bulldozed, and there's a surf shop there, and Uncle Dan's house is going, and there's a strip mall, and Hap's house, he was an interesting character. He came ashore in Duck from a shipwreck. He was from Portugal, and he loved it and loved the people so much he never left. So he was like our uncle from the time I can remember. Hap was there. He died right there. And he had this huge grapevine and all these chickens that ran around. And that grapevine is still there beside that gallery, which is now where his house was. But everything had changed so much, I thought, oh, my land. I had to go really slow. I couldn't even picture where I was.
I'm curious, when you experienced culture shock, how long had it been since you had been to Duck?
Actually, I had not. My Aunt Blanche was the last person that I used to visit regularly, and she died about 2 years ago. So I never really, her house was one of the first ones as you come in before you get into downtown Duck. And so I'd always stop at her house. I never went on into downtown Duck until this weekend, and I was like, oh my Lord, where am I? I couldn't believe it. It didn't look like Duck. I didn't even recognize the little Methodist church. Even that's had a facelift.
I have another question. While you were living in Wanchese, how long did it take you to get up to Duck when you were young?
Gosh, it seemed like all day. When
mean,
you're
were the
little,
roads
you
paved?
know. They were paved, and we spent a lot of time on the unpaved part. Like, as soon as we got to Duck, Aunt Blanche's house, Uncle Turner would get out the old International Harvester Jeep, and we'd go down the beach and go beachcombing and all the way up to Corolla. There was no paving there. But it was different. It was definitely different. I came home, I called my mom, I said, have you been to Duck lately? She said, no, I think I got to ride up. I said, you won't even know where you are.
For the time that I lived in Southern Shores, I attended that Duck church, and I can remember before it expanded when it was small.
When it was just a little one-room church and the yard was for the homecoming.
Right.
Because there was a big homecoming there every year. There's no yard there now.
Yep. Well, I remember as that church was growing and expanding with the community and with new arrivals, the pastor then was Bill Ruth. And he announced to the congregation that the church had been sold, was going to be moved up to Williamsburg. He said, it's going to be a bed and breakfast. He said, so if any of you would like to go up to Williamsburg and spend a night or to sleep in the church, then, you may want to do that. And somebody in the congregation said, preacher, some of us have already have.
Amazing.
Buster, tell us about Sundays that you spent with your father.
I think it's very interesting that what Carol Lee had to say a few minutes ago about Sundays being a special day. And one of the things that I remember most about growing up on the Outer Banks was my dad being in politics. There was always somebody calling on the telephone, and there was always someone wanting him to do something for them. Well, Sundays were reserved for the family, and we spent an awful lot of time exploring the Outer Banks along the shorelines and looking for different things. And I think Carol Lee probably did some of that same thing, soft crabbing.
Exactly.
And doing all kinds of things like that. But I brought a few little things with me to show folks what we would find on some of our trips. And I'm going to save this one because this was one of the last things that we found. But folks, off of Collington Island, this is an Indian pipe. It was found in an oyster bed. It actually has a reed hole. Now, this might not be exactly an Indian pipe. It might have been a colonist pipe, but this was found in an oyster bed on the northwest corner of Big Collington Island, and it was on a Sunday expedition, and this was the grand poobah of all the things that my dad and I found on some of our Sunday afternoon expeditions. I actually have a petrified sand dollar, and this, who knows how old this is, but after the program, if you'd like to come up and look at some of these things, this is actually, it's got the actual imprint right in the very top of it, and it's, as they say, solid as a rock. It was one of our great finds, and of course, something that a lot of the children of this day and time cannot find on the Outer Banks, and Horace and I talked about, this is our state shell. I found this probably when I was 7 or 8 years old, or maybe even younger than that. And I have many of these, but to go out and find these things, these Scotch bonnets, which is our state shell, is very hard to do, especially unless you know where to go find them. And fortunately, I know some places that you can find these. We will tell you later. And one of the things that I'm really proud of, this is something I found after my father passed away, and I was telling Horace that one of the things that my dad taught me was to always look for what you don't see. And when you're walking through a gravel bed, always look for the thing that shouldn't be there, the thing that's not as obvious as anything else. And this actually looks like an arrowhead, and I found this about 4 years ago in Kerala, walking in a gravel bed, and it's actually a fish scrape. Indians or colonists or someone, this thing is pretty old. It's been authenticated, and it's pretty old, but they used to scrape the fish, the meat out of the fish skins after they would cook them, and that's how they would eat them. And it's actually rounded off on one side, and it has some areas that have worn down because of the way they actually held the things. And the list continues. We would spend a lot of time, as some of you know, my dad had a big influence on Jockey's Ridge. We spent an awful lot of time walking on Jockey's Ridge. And one of the things I was telling Horace about growing up here on the Outer Banks was my grandfather had an SO service station right at the very foot of Jockey's Ridge. And my backyard was actually Jockey's Ridge when I was growing up as a little guy. After we moved from Manio to the beach, I had the biggest sand pile in the world to play with right behind my grandfather and grandmother's house. Everybody knows what fulgurite is, and if you don't know what fulgurite is, it's lightning that has struck the ground, and And this is crystallized sand, and there's thousands and thousands of pieces of fogarite in Jockey's Ridge and other areas on the Outer Banks. And my dad and I used to dig it up. It looked like tree limbs. It was just everywhere you could go, but we would dig this up, and just, we had the best time on Sunday afternoons doing these things together. Something that a lot of the kids on the Outer Banks don't get to do. Here's a seahorse. This seahorse is probably 30, maybe 35 years old. It's been in a shadow box that my dad built for me to keep these. Little horn-nosed fish found in a grass line, just walking on the beach. So Sunday afternoons were really special to me on the Outer Banks as it was to Carol Lee. I used to do the soft crabbing too. We'd find an old tire and reach down in there, and everybody'd say, "Oh, you're crazy for sticking your hands in there." But you know what? We'd pull out a soft crab with Carol Lee.
If you looked at the sand, you could sometimes see the outline of the edges of them in the sand, and you just dip them up. I can remember hardly even being able to walk. My mom had a blow up boat, and she'd put us in that boat and tie it to her waist, and we'd go up and down that shoreline with Aunt Blanche finding soft crabs, and then at night we'd have a big soft crab dinner because they found lots of them.
Yes.
Lots and lots.
That was so much fun. It was all along the backside of Nag's Head, all the way down to where Sugar Creek and RVs, all those places are. We used to walk those sound shores, and the same as Carol Lee and her family did, and it was just a great time. It's something that I think we need to bring back. You know, we need to bring some of this back. I know they have these boat trips that you can take and learn how to shrimp and crab and do all kinds of things. I think we need a lot more of that back on the Outer Banks, things that we grew up with.
Yeah, we'd start in Duck and walk all the way to Cabby's Inlet. It didn't seem like it took any time because you were so busy looking for those crabs.
Looking for what you couldn't see.
And I wish I'd have known you were bringing that. I'd have brought. My husband was big looking for things like this. We actually have a Buchanan pipe. It's a clay pipe, and on one side it's got a buck embossed, and on the other side it's got a cannon and a stack of cannonballs. And it was a commemorative pipe that came out when Buchanan, I think, was president. We have some of those that are clay that he found along the shore. We've got arrowheads mounted. He had tons of those. There's actually one that the Smithsonian came down and got. He donated to the Smithsonian because it was an arrowhead from a tribe of Indians that they said that they never knew were here. So they felt like that the Indians must have had some type of inter-tribal trade going on that they never knew before. But there's actually one in the Smithsonian that they donated. Great big one, big black one, about 5.5 inches long.
I'm going to have to go on some of your trips with you. I love finding that kind of stuff.
I know, man. And that was and bottles, bottle hunting too.
Yep.
All the old quart bottles and inkwells and things like that. Find all that. Aunt Blanche she knew all the best places to go. When the wind was blowing northeast and the tide was out on the sound, we'd go to where all the old hunt clubs had used to be, and we'd look for bottles and stuff in the shallows, because when the water was regular, you couldn't see it, but when the wind had blown northeast for a long time, I have Hoyt's 5-cent cologne bottles, 10-cent cologne bottles, 15-cent cologne bottles that we found all out there where everybody got clean on Saturday night, put their smell good on.
Here's one for you. And Carol Lee will know exactly what I'm talking about. We had telephone wires. They were copper wires. Remember the copper wires? And they were strung everywhere. In fact, if you go down to the New Inlet area, you can actually still see some of the poles that are out there from these poles. And remember the glass insulators?
Yep.
Remember the glass insulators? And I'll tell you what, they have become a treasure for a lot of people. I would dare to say what they would cost this day and time. The same with the bottles that Carol Lee talks about, the green, the blue, all the different colors. There are just so many things that the children of this day and time don't get to experience that we did as children on the Outer Banks.
That's
growing
true.
up.
You know, you just can't walk out behind somebody's house and go soft crabbing, or now people own the land all the way down to the water, and they're not real happy when they look out there and you're out there frogging around in their backyard.
Yep. Well, you know, there are still places that we can go where we can go ashore and be satisfied that nobody else has set foot. But you know, you have to get there by boat.
Yeah.
And again, that land belongs to someone too. But at the same time, there are still some reaches, and that's one of the things that I always enjoy. Now, y'all could talk about growing up on the Outer Banks as children. Eddie and I have to talk about growing up on the Outer Banks as adults, because we were late arrivals, but I also know that it's the people that are here. You know, when I came, people were very accepting of me and really embraced me and in some ways adopted me. And that really is what made a difference to me in my experience, because I was able to get out on the water and to have some of those same experiences. And, you know, at that time, you know, in the 70s and into the 80s, things hadn't quite changed as drastically as they have in recent years. But access is an issue, and you know, we also know that there's two sides to every story. And you know, I didn't give anybody any instruction to avoid controversy tonight, but we also know that there's two sides to every story, and access is something that people are fighting about today. And on one hand, we're certainly glad that the Park Service has been here to preserve so much of that land that lies between the communities on the southern banks, and certainly they maintain areas of rich heritage here that they're protecting and preserving. So we still have spaces where people can go, and you know, and I think that's really one of the biggest assets that we have over many coastal communities, and why the Outer Banks is really looked at as you know, a diamond in North Carolina.
We want to keep it that way too, right, Carolee?
We definitely do. And speaking of, I do have to say this. One of the things that was the most magical about being a kid on the Outer Banks was when the Christmas shop came. That was a tradition from as soon as it was built. We got to go every year. And then I started it with my kids. They got to go every year and get that one special ornament that was them. And I'll tell you, people still stop and ask at the Mans Harbor Post Office, where's the Christmas shop at? What happened to the Christmas shop? And I said, that is definitely a thing that has been as part of the Outer Banks tradition for kids as well as for grown-ups.
Right. And now your children's children are going to be able to go and
Yep, because now it's coming back, and everybody's so happy about that. Yay!
Yeah, we are.
I have to tell you, I really, getting a perspective on time, I think I arrived in the Outer Banks when you were both kids then, because the first time I walked down the streets of Madio was 1953. And the very same warmth that you're talking about grabbed me, because we, just walking down the street, people we've never seen before, the first words out of the mouth was, "You here for the pageant?" And I loved it, because they did call it the pageant in those days. And then I walked into Fearing's. That was the first air conditioning I experienced here on the island. And Alva and I didn't think I'd forget her name. It was the waitresses in Fearing's. And they served us our first hush puppies. But it was like Alma Wood, of course. And there was still, Ava Cutrell, yeah. But and Sybil, yeah. And just walking down the street. And you know, before we got here, I'd been approached by John Lehman in New York, would I be interested in being in a show? And he described the people to me. I mentioned this in a 10-minute talk I did yesterday. He described the people and the lifestyle and uniqueness of the area, and he didn't exaggerate. When I got down here, the first thing I did, because he said everybody went barefoot, and in the summertime that was true, and That year, 53, I kicked my shoes off on Memorial Day weekend, never put them back on again until we headed for New York right after Labor Day. And so I fell in love with it. I used to tell people I left Manhattan Island. There were probably more people, or many more people, living in one block in Manhattan than did in all of Dare County. I think the population then was about 4,000 people. And when we came down to set up the shop, it had only grown to 6,000. That was 14 years later that we decided to do the shop. But I have to ask you a question. You mentioned Sugar Creek.
Yes.
And I'd never heard of Sugar Creek before until RB started advertising that his place was located on Sugar Creek. And now there's some condos being built. Was that a creek in there? Was that always called Sugar Creek?
I believe so. As long as I've ever known it, it's like the landing down at Wan Cheese, Mill Landing. It's always been known as Mill Landing Creek, and those areas have carried those names for years. Buzzards Bay and over around Collington area, they're just names that stick. John's Ditch. How many times have you been down John's Ditch? I mean,
which was dug by slaves.
Yes, dug by slaves. There's a lot of things that are like that, and on the Outer Banks, things that just the average person wouldn't know. And I think that's where we need to share like we're doing right now. Talk about these things so people will understand how things started, where we began, why things are done a specific way, why we don't want to change those things, our heritage. It's really interesting to sit here and listen to everyone carry on the conversation, but do you realize in a 3-week period we lost 3 people here on the Outer Banks? One who sat on this stage last year, Everett Tate, who was postmaster in Nags Head.
And he hired me.
History, people who know the history of the Outer Banks and could share that history with everybody. There's just been, we're losing our heritage by the folks that have lived here, and now they're passing away. It's just like my parents. My dad was a world of knowledge. He helped, I believe, start the Outer Banks History Center, and that to me is a big thing, to know that he was a part of doing that too.
I had a chance to do a community project. We worked on saving Jockey's Ridge. And getting to know him, I was amazed. He had many sides to him because he was interested in silver and turquoise jewelry and was very proud of some of the pieces he'd created. How did he happen to get into that?
My dad, I was telling Horace a little bit earlier tonight, my dad was like a page out of Popular Mechanics magazine. He did a lot of things that other people wouldn't do, and I'll share this story with you really quickly. Horace, I know that you don't want to hear this, but I'm going to tell it anyway. My dad built my mother a pair of shoes so that she could help aerate his yard. And what he did was he took a pair of old roller skates and he nailed plywood to the bottom, or actually screwed plywood to the bottom, but it had 16-penny nails driven through the bottom of the plywood so it would actually stick down. And he strapped them on my mother and said, okay, you can walk out in the yard anywhere you want to go now because you're going to be aerating the yard. And the first thing she did was stepped onto some of his underground irrigation, and of course that ended those shoes. And I still have those shoes, by the way, that he made. That's a story that'll live on forever. But
what I'd like to know is what he had on her to make her do that.
I tell you what, that was the most loving pair of parents anybody could have ever had. It was awesome.
You have to say the same thing. I had great parents. I mean, they took us to do things. They gave us the freedom. I was in the Lost Colony. I was 13. My dad drove me up every night from Wine Cheese, came back, sat in that parking lot every night till 11:30, and then drove home and then got up and went to work the next day. Right. So I could earn my $10 a week and buy my own school clothes. It was the principle of the thing. But I tell you what, looking back, you just don't find parents dedicated like that. I mean, I had great parents. They taught me things about the Outer Banks. They taught me they just taught me a lot of things, and they have a lot of love. And they're both 86 years old and still going strong.
Here's one for you, Carol Lee. Did they ever say to you, don't ever forget who you are when you left the house to go out? Because my mom used to tell me that all the time, and I looked at her one time and I said, Mom, who am I? And she said, you're my son and your dad's son, and you need to respect us and to be the person that we want you to be. And, you know, I've never forgotten that. They never, I never went without, even during the Ash Wednesday storm, where we lost a lot of stuff that, from our house, you know, my mom's whole house had to be totally rebuilt because of the Ash Wednesday storm. I watched her cry, but I never went without having anything. My parents always gave me what I needed. Of course, I was the only child too. Now, if I'd had some brothers and sisters, that might have been a little bit different. But that's one thing I can say about my parents and being a part of the Outer Banks community. Never went without anything. My mom carried me, like Carol Lee was talking about, to anything that I wanted to go. My dad hated sports. He thought that if there was a baseball or a basketball or a football, they could punch a hole in it and let the air out of it. He didn't really like sports, but I tell you, he was one of a kind, very unique individual.
How old would you have been about the time of the Ash Wednesday storm?
I was actually 9 years old, and I can remember it just like it was yesterday. I got ready to go to school along with all the other children in my neighborhood, and we started out to the street, and all of a sudden the ocean water started rushing across the road, and before too long it was 6 to 10 inches deep in the beach road, and it kept coming. And I can remember we retreated to the back part of my mom and dad's store, and we stood on the concrete and we watched the water just keep on coming in. And shortly after that, I'd say by 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, I can remember my dad standing me on the toilet or the commode in the bathroom, and I watched the water come into our house and actually fill the bathtub. Water just washed into the bathtub, and it was a very unique experience. There were a lot of families, the Jordans, Hopkins, and other people that lived in the neighborhood, and we all went to my grandmother's house. It was about 4 foot off of the ground, and the water kept coming up, and finally my Uncle Charles came from Collington in a 16-foot Juniper skiff and took all of us out except for my dad and Mr. Jordan, and they stayed there until the water was 4 inches deep in the house, and then they left the house and they retreated to Collington. Growing up through that period of time and watching the stress and the strain on people, I watched Bowen's store burn to the water line. My dad had an airboat which we used on those Sunday afternoon trips. He rescued 40 people with that boat. If you look at the Ash Wednesday storm book, which David Stick and Walter Gresham did, you'll actually see a picture of that boat in that magazine. It actually tells that story. But
and they airlifted some people off of Jockey's Ridge, too.
They did. It was an amazing time. The oil tanker that fell into the split in the road down at Soundside Road, where the water actually rushed through. The bypass actually created a dam, and all the water had built up on one side of it, and it had to go through a specific place. And there was a huge culvert underneath that road right there where the new church is, the Nag's Head Church. And it just created just a tremendous amount of water went through that area at one time, took out the whole road.
Well, you know, for a period of time I lived in a garage down on East Soundside Road, and it was one that was beside Midget Seafood. And when I was in there cleaning the garage and I set up a woodworking shop, and there was an apartment on the back. And the wall had been pushed from the garage into the apartment, and I thought somebody had just pulled a car in there and had knocked the wall out. And then after I cleaned up a little bit more, I saw the tide line. It was about 4 feet up, and realized that it was the Ash Wednesday storm that had pushed that wall.
It was 4 foot in my dad's store and 36 inches in our house. That's how high the ocean water came. I'd like to just tell this real quick story. I think it's a real important story because it shows a lot about the true Outer Banker. And Some of you folks will remember Bill and Inez Anderson, who owned Anderson's store on the north end of the beach. And if you look at this Ash Wednesday Storm book, you'll see a picture right in the very beginning of Anderson's store. You can't really make it out, but it's the brick building with a side busted out of it. Anyway, my dad and Uncle Charles and some other men went with the airboat, and they rescued Bill and Inez and took them to Collington. And once they got them to Collington, and I mean, you could run this airboat almost anywhere there was an inch of water. You could go with this boat, and they ran it everywhere. And folks, let me tell you how long it ran. It ran one time until the exhaust pipes and all of the engine cowlings turned pure white. That's how long it ran. It rescued and it ran all this stuff. But back to the Bill Anderson story. Once they got them there, Bill Anderson turned around to my Uncle Charles and he said, "Charles," he said, "you and Carl have got to go back to my store." And my uncle said, "Well, why?" He says, "Because my life savings are hanging in the ceiling of my store and you need to go back and get it for me." Well, there was no IRS people listening to this, but Bill and Inez had towels, like you go into a lot of the souvenir stores on the Outer Banks and you see towels that are pinned to the ceiling and everything. Well, they had stuffed their life savings up there, 20s, 100s, 50s, all kinds of currency were in these beach towels, and there were literally hundreds of them covering the ceiling in this store. And so my dad and Uncle Charles went back and they took each one of those beach towels and pulled them off the ceiling and folded them up and brought them back to Bill and Inez. And Bill Anderson passed away many years ago, but Inez, the last I heard, she was living over around Edenton area, but her retirement was well taken care of. Ash Wednesday.
Now, the Ash Wednesday storm was March 6th, wasn't it? 6th?
It
was March 7th?
March 7th.
Yeah.
62.
And,
Yeah,
well, I mean, I know it
1962.
was 62 because I came down that Memorial Day weekend. I had decided it was too late for me to try and even think of being in the Lost Colony. I'd done it in 53 and 54 and would come back and visit. But Memorial Day weekend, I discovered I had my summer free, and I thought I'd come down to the Outer Banks Memorial Day weekend and see what was going on. And even then, the number of buildings that were still tilted, I mean, people were still recovering. And I helped the folks who owned the Shore Acre Motel dig out empty 2 rooms that were filled right up to the ceiling with sand. And then I ended up staying that whole summer. That was a very lean year for the Lost Colony because the tourism obviously wasn't much. A certain number of people came down. And as I recall, the wells, well, everybody's wells were ruined because of the seawater. So a tanker came down from Elizabeth City every day, and people would walk from their cottages to the road to fill up on water. Do you remember that?
I remember a lot of things about the Ash Wednesday storm, a lot of individual stories about the Ash Wednesday storm, but this is one fact I want everybody to hear, and it's my theory about what happened. Mother Nature wanted to cleanse the Outer Banks of the weak, and Mother Nature did it. And she took out all the weak, and from that we have what we have today. We built the beach boxes, we built the large houses and everything. Do I think that Mother Nature will do that again? And the answer to that is yes. Mother Nature is going to cleanse the beach one more time in my lifetime, and we'll do it all over again. We'll come back just as strong as we did after the Ash Wednesday storm, and I think that's a thing about the Outer Banks people. They're residual. You know, they're very determined people. Carol Lee's family and all the other folks. When the tide rises on the Sound, it rises in Wanchese, and it rises in Collington.
Stumpy Point,
Stumpy
Mansell
Point,
Harbor.
everywhere. It always rises one way or the other with a hurricane or anything like that. I've seen telephone poles down in the beach road for as far as you can see from Donna or Hazel. I can't remember which storm it was.
Yeah, I've seen them snapped off in a cold
I mean,
front.
just snapped right off and laid over just like somebody had taken a chainsaw and cut them off uniformly all the way as far as you can see. It's just an amazing sight, and I think that Mother Nature is going to show us her power once again, and it's going to take out those weak cottages and structures that we have, and we're going to come back even stronger than we did. after the Ashwenazi storm.
Well, that's one thing you say about the Outer Banks. We have weather. We just don't have ho-hum. I can remember, and wasn't even a hurricane. I was delivering the mail on the beach road, driving along my little mail car, minding my own business, turned right on the road that goes up to the Collington Light to deliver to Miss Henrietta Twyford. Delivered to her mailbox, pulled on up to turn around. In my rearview mirror, I saw Dorothy's tornado sucking the roof off of the Wilbur and Warville Wright Motel, and I thought, am I seeing that? I actually stopped the car and got out, and the telephone poles were just going up, 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 all the way, and it was coming my way, and I thought, oh, what do I do? So I parked the car and crouched down in the floor, and I thought, this is not smart. If it can pick up a telephone pole, it can pick up the car. So I got back up and started the car, and I thought, Kill Devil Hills, they're a fallout shelter. I drove to the light and turned right and went to the fallout shelter. Well, everybody from the town was not in the fallout shelter. We were all standing out in the front yard watching. And it tore that motel up. It tore up telephone poles, and then as quick as it came, it was gone. Just like that. But it left a lot of devastation. It killed Miss Henrietta. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just in a split second. The weather here can just take you away.
Well, speaking of that, I know that in watching squall lines come through, many times they take that track, they come down the Albemarle Sound, and they cut right across in Kill Devil Hills or right there at Collington. If they don't go down Croatan Sound and out the inlet, many times they'll go right across that path. So that is a stormy track.
They take the path of least resistance. I don't think a lot of people that have not lived here, Carol Lee probably knows this from her family telling her this, but it's like thunderstorms. They take the path of least resistance. You can go out of Oregon Inlet and be fishing offshore in the afternoon, and you can see this big thunderhead, and you don't even have to look at your compass or your Loran or anything like that. You just go right straight to that thunderhead, and it'll take you right to the inlet because it's going to take that path of least resistance. That's the same thing we have with that little narrow strip of land there right by Wright Brothers. And Carol Lee, I want you to know I was there with you right after that because I was one of the ones that found the lady in the ditch. Miss Henrietta.
She was Bill Twyford's aunt.
Yep.
The postmaster at Kill Devil Hills' aunt. He had to go and identify her.
We had people in those houses that she's talking about pulling the roofs off of those houses. There was a family, this lady had 4 children and herself right in this house, right where she's talking about. And they laid on the floor in this house, and the roof literally picked up off this house and just exploded into the air. It just totally, and she was still laying on those children shaking when the fire people got there, and I was a part of the fire department, like I told you earlier, Horace, for 22 years in Nags Head. And when something like that happens, it's amazing the turnout you get from the people that live here and the volunteers.
Was that right across near the Wilbur and Orville?
Yes.
Right, okay. I remember that too.
What year was that?
Oh my gosh, it had to have been in the 83, 84, somewhere along in there, because before this
84,
before this had happened, I saw the thing. It was like it just curly-cued back up over top of the beach road, and I saw it, and people were coming in the driveway at my dad's hardware store saying, "What should we do?" And I said, "Drive south," because I didn't know what else to tell them. I just wanted them to go south, but the force of Mother Nature, and right in that same area, let's go to Kellogg's store. Here's another story about a tornado and how it can scare you. I mean, one of the hardest rains, the wind was blowing and carrying on, and all the pagers go off, the fire pagers go off. We go to Kellogg's store area, and I was the second or third person there. Power lines down everywhere. There was a house that Elwood Parker, a plumber, used to own there, and his wife, Helen, had sold the house to some folks. It had turned that house completely around, and the man and woman were in bed in this house. It was like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. It actually wrenched his back. It turned the house so quickly. His Honda Civic had turned up on its side. Emergency flashers were going off, and the alarm was beeping on the car. But here's the most amazing thing. In the side of Kellogg's store was a paper towel center out of paper towel, and there were pieces of pine straw that were actually literally stuck in the side of the building, undaunted by any kind of stress. The force of that wind had actually stuck those things in the side of that building, and it was just an unbelievable sight. We took pictures of it. We stood there and amazed with our flashlights and everything about the force of Mother Nature, and it's just amazing some of the phenomena we have here on the
We
Outer
do.
Banks.
Well, some of you were lucky enough to have your parents bring you here. The rest of us who found our way on our own have really come here because of the evidence of nature and the forces of nature, and not so much the the dramatic or the cataclysmic, but the things that we see from day to day.
I tell you one thing, when we came back in '67, I couldn't have afforded to buy a piece of property in those days, and it wasn't expensive. But I ended up picking the location for the Christmas shop because Melly Pierce owned the property. And when Donna came over, Donna was 1960, and when that came over Roanoke Island, it brought water up to the level of the windows, the windowsill of the house. And after that, nobody wanted that property.
Yep.
So, I mean, that was what do you call it, a fire sale, a water sale.
Right.
So, I mean, Melly sold it, was very generous and sold it to us at a great price.
Well, she was very generous to me too, because that's how you and I met, was really through Melly.
Yeah.
And I was living on Sir Walter Raleigh Street in the old Heath home, which was seven rooms, and it had been locked up. She had locked it up, and someone who had lived there previously had vandalized it and abused it, and she had determined that she wasn't going to rent it again. But I was looking for a place to live, and I found out who owned the house, and I gave her a call and talked with her on the phone, and I told her I was handy with tools, and I would help her fix the house up, and I would take care of it. And I said, well, how much will you charge me for rent? She said, well, I'll tell you what, son. She said, I'll just let you live there for free. And she did for 18 months. And that helped me get my feet on the ground and to get a good start here. But and it was months after that before she and I ever met. But that's the type of people that we're talking about.
Edward Green's that type of person. I had someone telling me a story today about Edward Green and about how he gave him his first job, and before the day was out, he found him a place to live.
I know who you're talking about, Joe Mallet.
You do?
Yeah, right?
Yes.
Well, I just, if you can help people, why not?
I
Actually, I got him an apartment upstairs over Ruby Smith's back building where she did the pottery, the ceramics.
But I thought that was a great story. We talked about the Land of Beginnings Festival this morning, and that was a story, and Joe was very proud of that.
Right. Well, I don't think there are many people in the community that Eddie hasn't touched. And in a conversation some time back, Eddie and I were talking about his role here on the Outer Banks, and we talked about different communities where you've grown up and where you experienced your childhood, and I think Eddie and I probably have fond memories of Manteo too, but Edward was really a driving force at the time that he made a commitment to accept a civic responsibility and to do things that would make a difference.
There's a lot of folks that don't remember all the things that happened in the early years when I was 3 or 4 years old. A big old hotel that was on the waterfront, actually right out from the way we go out of this building, out by the boat ramp.
The Tranquil House.
Well, it was actually, there's this big old hotel that
Across
was
the street
there
from
and
that,
burned many years ago right there, and then the Davis store burned on the waterfront. Manteo burned many times in the
3
downtown
times.
area. And I can remember living down this very street that right there by the Methodist Church. One of my good friends was Jack Kellogg and Betty Kellogg, and I can remember during that fire, my mom and dad bringing me down, and they had taken an old Ziegler heater. Remember the old tall Ziegler heaters that they used to have, the oil heaters?
Yeah.
And it sat me on top of that to keep me warm while the fire was going on. And of course, I was just a little guy. I was scared to death because there were sirens and people running around screaming and carrying on. But there was an awful lot of things that went on the Outer Banks in Manteo, for instance. Pioneer Theater, that was one of my favorite places. Carol Lee knows that. She took many a young man to the Pioneer Theater.
Oh, no, I don't know about that. I was kind of like the neighborhood car mom. When on Friday night, if word got out that I was going to the movie, come movie time, I had 25 kids at the house ready to go to the Pioneer. And we always found room for them all, and off we went.
No, I was talking about what
I know what you're
boyfriends.
talking about. I was trying to not.
Carol Lee was quite the young lady back in her high school days.
Yes,
Yeah,
and now
well,
you know why my parents' hair is gray.
Right, I heard, yeah. No, I heard a story about Carol Lee on the back row of the Pioneer Theater one time. Somebody said that they thought she was playing checkers, and I said, well, why is that? They said, well, she said, if you make one more move like that, I'm gonna crown you.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me tell you just another real quick story about Pioneer Theater. Ben Creef and George Creef used to love to tease people with their popcorn. And the way they would do it is they had this popcorn machine that was right there in the middle, you know, where they had the two doors going into the theater. There were only two doors. There was two in and two out. You know, it was ingress and egress. But they would go in there and they'd load that popcorn machine up, and just about the time the movie would start, they'd start popping that popcorn. And the smell, I think they had fans to circulate it through the building, because I can remember that so good, going there and spending time. I saw an awful lot of movies there. In fact, I was probably one of the more fortunate children that they actually took up in the projection room and let me look through the little hole. You know how that was back being a little kid. That was so much fun because it was an experience that nobody else had experienced, and that was a great place. It was a part of our heritage, that movie theater.
Well, we're lucky that HA is carrying on that tradition.
Oh,
You know,
man.
that's something else that I think that this community can appreciate too.
And he stuck it out in the lean days when the movie started opening up at the beach. Keep in mind that at one time that was the only movie house in, I was going to say all of Dare County. There was a movie house over in Nan's Harbor, I believe. But am I wrong about that? Yeah. I am wrong? Okay. I mean, actually, we were told, somebody else contradicted me recently and said it was a theater, and I called it a movie house. Okay, but that's part of the building that we now have inside the Christmas shop. Yeah, and then what was left, the back part of we have the first floor, the windows and the columns that we used to build a duplicate of the general store.
Yes.
Right.
But one thing I remember years ago, and I think it was probably in the early 70s, and I don't think Jack Richardson had built his first twin theater yet, but since it was the only movie house around, HA was very accommodating, and if enough people in the Lost Colony, now I know it because summer of '62, I was that summer that I just stayed down there. I wasn't in the show, but if enough people, if the Lost Colony signed up that they wanted to see the show, he'd run a show about 11:45 at night.
Yep,
Start the
midnight
popcorn
shows.
machines up
Yep.
again and everything, so that and that was every time the movie changed. The first night he would. If they signed up, they would always call in. We've got 30 people want to see the show. He'd open up.
Did he do the popcorn like I was just describing? Wait until the movie was almost to start?
I don't remember that. It was the cheapest popcorn around, so you bought it
was.
anyway. Oh, it's
But it was
fabulous.
delicious.
Yeah,
Still is.
yeah. And that's right. It's still a bargain when you think about what things cost.
Can't tell you how many nights it was dinner. No supper tonight. We're going to the Pioneer. Pioneer dinner was popcorn.
You know, there was a lot of places that we spent a lot of time, and Edward was talking earlier about the old Farron's drugstore and
Yep.
about those things, but Betty Alice and
Alan
Lee.
Allen's Confectionery. I can remember going in there and orange aids and cherry cokes and hamburgers, sometimes before school let out, but you know, we had a great time. It was a very unique experience for all of us growing up, and Carol Lee and I both got a chance to experience that, and we need more of that today. We really do. Places where kids can go and spend time like we did and enjoy people who want your business, you know, and care for you. And Betty and Alan both did that. She was a hoot.
Still is.
She still is. Her and Alice Kellogg. Alice Kellogg
yeah.
was another one that was a very unique person in our lives. She spent time doing things with us, and you know, I can remember going on top of Farron's store one time during a snowstorm and pushing snow off on all the kids waiting downstairs throwing snowballs at everybody. And she went up, took a shovel, and actually shoveled it off the side of the building on top of us. And she just was laughing. Of course, we got her back. She had to come down.
You know, talking about local characters, everybody's got to remember Dottie Drinkwater.
Oh, yes.
And that ties in beautifully with the post office, because she was known many a morning to be in her nightgown in the post office.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it. I saw it happen. I don't know how many of the others of you have experienced that.
And Mac Ray's store in Wanchese, that was a staple for us kids. I mean, and for the fishermen. One half was the commercial fishing supply. The other half was a soda box and pickles and groceries and stuff like that. I've spent a many a day combing the ditches, picking up soda bottles to go cash in for that 5 cents so that we could get drinks and pickles. But I mean, that was where everybody went for anything.
Right.
And all the men, they gathered round in there on the days that it was blowing, and there was a checkerboard in there. They talked about the fishing and things changing and the time.
And boats, skiffs that he would rent to the tourists.
Yep.
Folks, one thing that hasn't changed in all the years that we've lived here on the Outer Banks, if you go to Sam and Omi's today, Sam and Omi's is exactly like it was, with the exception of the gas pumps that were in front. It's the same place. I don't think it's changed hardly at all. I mean, it's just to me, it's an experience, an Outer Banks experience, and I love going there. Great.
Emmylou Harris made a statement in a documentary that stuck in my head once. She was talking about how everybody used to gather around and play the music and sing just for the music, just in the living rooms after, you know, around the piano. And she said, you know, the living room is going out of the music. And that's kind of like, it feels like sometimes like we're losing something here, like it's slipping away. Like the casualness, the warmth of the Outer Banks is slipping away somehow. It's diversifying so fast and furious that I don't think anybody can keep up.
Well, you know, as unique as we are here, I don't think that we're unique in that way. And that I think that that's something that's, you know, that we see as we become a global community. And as we're more connected to what's happening around the world, it's easy, it's necessary to detach from some of those things for us to be able to live through the day. Because if we really dwelt on some of the things that we see and some of the things that we come in contact with, it's because it's a different world. We're much more insulated than we were in years past, when people lived and were born, lived and died in the same house, and all the members of the family were part of that experience from the beginning to the end. Those are things that we don't experience, and that's I think really part of our culture. But I do believe that you can stop just about anywhere, and if you stop long enough and you get to know the people, you find that they're not very much different anywhere else in the world. We just happen to be lucky to live in this wonderful place and to have known all these people who have made such an impression on us. And I think, though, that that's one of the common threads that just runs through our human experience, is that we want to reach out and we want to be connected to others. But in this fast-paced world that we live in, we just don't have that opportunity often enough. And I think that's why opportunities like this are special. And I just want to take a minute to just kind of extend an invitation to our audience. For those of you who have stories to tell, and who would like to tell those stories. You know, one of our partners is the Outer Banks History Center, and they're very much interested in preserving the oral histories of our communities. And I'd like to encourage you to contact the History Center or to contact me, and you know, let us know of people that you know that have stories to tell, that can share them so that they can be preserved. Some of the things that I know about the Elizabethan Gardens are from oral histories, interviews with David Stick and Louis Midget, for instance. There's the font that's on the mount in the gardens. I passed it dozens of times until I heard the conversation between Louis and David, and Louis explained that the grooves that were in that marble font were from ropes that pulled the bucket up. And I never passed that font now without pointing that out to someone else. But unless that tape had been made, that tape that now resides in the History Center, unless that tape had been made, I would still be walking by that font and not appreciating that fact.
Really quickly, just to tie something you said just a few minutes ago, and I know we're getting close to the end of our little group getting together here. One of the things that's happening now is we're talking about our accesses to our beaches and different things. And if people go back in the history of Dare County and the things that used to happen, I believe it was Toby Tillett years ago had a ferry that he ran across Oregon Inlet from one side to the other. The bookmobile traveled down the beach. It was a Willis Jeep, and I know the lady who drove that bookmobile because she was my mother-in-law. And a lot of other people use that beach, and it to me, that's a part of our heritage, being able to use that beach, just like we were talking about using the water. So I think we need to make everyone aware of what our heritage really is and how important the beaches are to us and how important the access to those beaches is, because it was a part of the beginning of Dare County and Currituck and other places. The beaches were how we got to where we were going to go. The water was how we got to where we were going to go. Things have changed, and what you said just a few minutes ago about how culture has changed things and how we've got so many people now that it's changing our lifestyles and everything. I think we need to go back to thinking in the old way sometimes about how we look at things, and I believe that a precedent has been set, and I think we need to understand that. You know, Oregon Inlet Spit wasn't made by Mother Nature. A park ranger planted grass, and that's how Oregon Inlet Spit got started. He put it out there because when I was a kid, you could go out of the Oregon Inlet Fishing Center, under the bridge, and directly to the ocean. And when the ranger there, I think his name was Roush, planted the beach grass, it created a sand fence, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And
right.
So that's how we have the Oregon Inlet Spit.
Right, but you know, we also know that on the East Coast, the nature of an inlet is to build on the north side and to cut away at the south side.
And it did.
You know, that progression continues. And you know, I remember my father bringing me here. My first visit to the Outer Banks was in 1964. He wanted to see that new bridge. And we actually fished on the north side. We actually fished on the north side of the inlet on that trip. But,
amazing.
Right, but things do change. Things do change, and not always for the better. But at the same time, we're fortunate to live in a community that calls itself the land of beginnings and looks back and reflects on that rich history that we do have, whether it's here at Roanoke Island Festival Park, where one can come and visit and see 400 years of Outer Banks and Roanoke Island history, and this is just a perfect place for someone who's new to the area, or even someone who's lived here and needs to be reminded of some of that history to see it. We're just so lucky to have treasures like this that will allow people to have that insight. And you know, I think as we talk, it's also interesting to note that the exhibits that are here at Roanoke Island Festival Park end with the bridges, which came in the 50s. and really were the kind of the beginning of the Outer Banks as we know it, when people gained more access and ready access, and it became much easier. And I know that we get dismayed sometimes when we see people who come here to the beach and what they want to do is to shop and to go to movies and to ride around.
Go to Christmas shop.
Yes. So, you know, it's what the visitors who come to the Outer Banks are much of what makes the Outer Banks what it is today. And the people that come here are the ones that we need to connect with so that they can understand the traditions that have been held here. And I know that all of you are in a position to do that. And I really appreciate all of you coming here tonight to share some of your memories and to make that connection, because as people see the tapes of your stories in years to come, I hope that they'll reflect on the desires and the wishes that you have for this place to bring memories to people in the future that are as dear to you as your memories of the past. Edward, I'm going to let you just close with what it feels like to be honored. No, I want you to just tell us what it feels like to be honored as a living legend.
I said yesterday I was embarrassed. And it's strange to get this designation, but I've got to get out of this. I want to ask you a question.
All right.
Seriously.
You're released.
Was your father I want to tell you an interesting story. Was he one of the people who encouraged the History Center to do these recordings years ago?
Yes. Because
Sarah Downing and Kaylee Spears, about 5 years ago, contacted me, and they told me, I don't know whether you know this or not, that just a few weeks before your father passed, you made them promise that they would do an interview with me.
Yes.
And I was awed by that. And David Stick got wind of it, and he asked them, could he come and be the interviewer? Because we had worked on so many different projects together. And out of it came a 2-hour exchange that was hilarious, but I'd love to, it's full of facts.
That was one thing that he wanted to do. He made me promise six things. He only made you guys promise one thing, but he made me promise 6 things, and I've lived up to all of them. But I think it's real important for us to record this history. Anybody that has been here for as many years as David Stick and other people need to go to the History Center, and they need to sit down and talk about things. I love listening to Della Bass Knight talk. Anybody who has anything to say about the Outer Banks. Mark Bass Knight is a world of information if you just get him to open up. He knows so much. Mark and I used to go to Oregon Inlet and clam years ago, and down on the shoals down there, and there's just so many things that people could tell about things that have happened here. And Eddie, you're right. My dad did encourage all of that, and he gave an awful lot of stuff, a lot of papers and things that he wanted people to remember things about the Outer Banks. A lot of the political history. We haven't been the friendliest politicos in the country. There's them and us, and it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. We're not shooting at each other, but we sure are not. We need to become better patrons or better people in our community, and we need to record all this history. I guess the biggest thing. He was. You're right.
So Eddie, we're we're glad that you're humbled to be the living legend.
Well,
and we're happy that you're here with us tonight.
I was involved in so many different projects and organizations, but I think one of the things is that me? I'm sorry about it. I think one of the things I'm proudest of, I was rewarded just last year when back in the 70s, the social department, social services wanted to raise some money at Christmas for a Christmas party. And as it was explained to me, they could not go out and really solicit funds. It was something that officially they weren't supposed to do. But they put this bird whisper in my ear, and they told me about a family they knew that the children were going to get absolutely nothing. And so I decided I would provide them the son and the daughter each needed a coat. And it's strange enough because I have a big shop, but the bottom line is I'm not a shopper, and I really hate to shop. And so we went up to Military Circle. That had been open a short while, and I went into the department store about 2 weeks before Christmas, and I hate the crowds. I hated being out of Dare County, but I managed to go through and find something for each of those kids. And then I took it down to social services and left it with them. And at a fish fry recently, well, it was about last year, a young woman, I guess she'd probably be in her early 30s or late 20s. No, because that was in 70, so it's over the 30 years. But she walked up to me and she said, "Mr. Green, I've known about you all my life because I want you to know I'm the person you gave the coat to." And that was about as rewarding a thing as I could ever experience. So, you know, I feel a part of the community, and I've never regretted one moment coming down here. All thanks to John Lehman and to Melly Pierce.
Horace, just really quickly, I just want to ask one question.
Yes.
Yesterday, when Andy Griffith made the statement that you had a going out of business sale.
Oh.
And you had got him and his lovely wife in there, and they had bought some items and everything. And then he said, and now he's going back into business. I want to know, did you get a whole lot of money out of him on that sale, that going out of business sale?
No, not really. He came like everybody else and bid on some antiques. You know, I have to tell you, I have a confession to make about yesterday. Because when I was talking about when we announced we were going to open up a store and sell art and Christmas decorations in the summertime, and Andy was already out in Hollywood. We'd been in the show together in 1953, but this is now 1967, and I've been in touch with him over the years. But he was down here on a visit, and he went around telling everybody. I did not know this in the beginning, but he told me he was proud of the fact that he went around telling everybody, he's crazy, he's going to lose his shirt. And when I told that story yesterday, after I announced that, and Andy said I was going to lose my shirt, and I went, "Nya, nya, 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 nya." I said, I've never felt that psychologically free. I don't think of myself as a comedian, but I was really proud of that.
Yeah, but here's the deal. Now Andy Griffin can say he knows Edward Green, the living legend. What do you think about that? You know, all these years you've talked about Andy Griffith. Now Andy Griffith can say.
I was honored. It was impressive that he came because, you know, I think a lot of Andy, and as people get older, they also treasure their privacy. And he and Cindy do treasure their privacy, and for him to make the effort to come out there was overwhelming. The whole event was overwhelming, actually. So and I said, if it weren't for Dare County, it created a life for me as well as giving me an opportunity to do things back. I can never express my appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To you natives.
Well, you know, old Tom is one of the heroes of the Lost Colony because he's the one whose character changes throughout the play. But
Roanoke, oh Roanoke, thou hast made a man.
Right.
I knew where you were going.
Right. And Carol Lee can paraphrase that and say, "Thou hast made a woman of me."
I was Queen's page. I'm still taking orders.
Well, I want to thank you, Eddie, for doing what you've done, and we're certainly honored to have you at the Land of Beginnings as the living legend and here with us tonight. Carolee Tillett, we thank you for your recollections.
Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, and your courage for being up here with us tonight. And Buster, thanks for standing in, jumping in, and when you approached me yesterday and said, I'd really like to be a part of what you're doing next year, and I said, well, let's just not wait, let's do it tomorrow night. And I'm glad that I did.
Called me at 9 o'clock last night.
I have one thing to say. You almost deny that you're a native. Look at you. You're so handsomely dressed and a tie. And I pride myself that when I came down here, I wore ties, and now I did yesterday. And beyond that, I hope never to wear a tie again.
Well, I don't get to do it very often, but I just felt like it was really important to show people how I like to dress.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here tonight. I've enjoyed it, and I know that the audience has too. And I want to thank you for coming as well.
Thanks.